Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ISJL Virtual Vacation. My name's Nora Katz. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the Sephardic Jewish communities in the South, specifically those in Atlanta, Georgia, and Montgomery, Alabama. Sephardic history has occupied a marginal position in broader Jewish stories, and only recently have scholars begun to do in-depth research into Southern Sephardic communities. That's why today we're going to start unpacking some of that history. We'll specifically focus on the Sephardic Jews that came to Montgomery and Atlanta and the two congregations they formed, Or VeShalom and Etz Ahayem. Let's dive in. I co-produced this episode with ISJL History and Heritage intern Annika Jones, and we spoke to a lot of people about these two communities. So let's start out with an introduction to our cast of characters. First, the current leaders of Congregation Or VeShalom and Agudath Israel Etz Ahayem.
My name is Rabbi Scott Kramer. I have been the rabbi of Agudath Israel Etz Ahayem Synagogue here in Montgomery since 2007.
My name is Adam Kofinas. I'm the executive director of Congregation Or VeShalom. I've been here almost 6 years, and originally from New York. My running joke is that I'm the product of an intermarriage, not the one you think. So my mom's family are all sort of USSR mix. My dad's family are Greek Jews. So grew up with a lot of Sephardic customs and also with Ashkenazi customs. So kind of one foot in both worlds.
I'm Rabbi Josh Hershen. I am the rabbi at Congregation Or VeShalom. I started here in July of 2020, right in the midst of the pandemic.
Next, meet Mimi Brown-Wooten, whose scholarship on Southern Sephardic Jews is an essential part of the framework for this episode.
Well, my name is Mimi. I was an ISJL intern in 2019, a history and heritage intern, so I feel like that's kind of where my trajectory started. And I was working on my master's at the time in Jewish studies, and now I'm a PhD student at the University of Michigan in the history department and at the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies. And my work, as an early graduate student, is still taking shape. But generally speaking, I work on the modern Sephardi diaspora, and I wrote my master's thesis on the Ottoman Sephardi communities in Atlanta, Georgia, and Montgomery, Alabama.
Throughout the episode, you'll also hear selections from the ISJL's Oral History collection. We conducted several interviews in Montgomery in 1999 with individuals who either immigrated to the South from Rhodes or who were the first generation of their families to be born in the United States.
My name is Albert Kapp. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was born April the 8th, 1922.
So my name is Ralph Abraham Franco.
My name is Maurice Kapuya. I was born on the island of Rhodes, the Dokanese Island, which is islands between Greece and Turkey. At the time that I was born was in 1913.
In 2004, we did a pretty casual follow-up interview with Maurice Kapuya and his wife, Jeanette.
And what's your full name as well?
Jeanette D. Kapuya. I was a Cohen.
A Cohen before.
Kapuya.
Okay.
We've been there 62 years.
62 years. Congratulations.
It's coming up 62. November.
That's wonderful. And when and where were you born?
I was born in Texas, Fort Worth, Texas.
Okay.
Finally, we spoke to Dan Masley, a former president of Congregation Or VeShalom, who is doing really important work to document the history of Atlanta's Sephardic community.
I'm Daniel Masley, or Dan, or Danny. I've been called all three. And I was born in Atlanta in 1933. And I have two brothers, both deceased, more older than me. And my father immigrated to Atlanta from Izmir, Turkey in 1913. He was born in 1897, and he and his brother, Maurice Masley, immigrated here. And my mother was born in Izmir, Turkey also. And she and her family, she had five siblings. They left Turkey in 1913, but they ended up in Cuba. Not quite sure what the story was, but they stayed there. And then in 1920, my mother came here to Atlanta And then, of course, she met my father, and then they got married in 1926.
But first, who are we talking about? The term Sephardic Jews refers to the Jews and their descendants who were exiled from Spain in 1492. I'll let Mimi Brown-Wooten take us a little bit more into the weeds on this terminology.
We tend to think, especially in the United States, of Jews as either Sephardi or Ashkenazi. And sometimes we talk about Mizrahi Jews, which is a term that came out of the Israeli context, and typically refers to Mizrach in Hebrew is east, so like Eastern Jews. Mizrahi sometimes translated as Oriental Jews, who were in the Middle East, in places like what's now Syria and Yemen and Egypt. And in the United States, there are also Mizrahi Jews in the United States, of course, but Sephardi Jews, actually, interestingly, the first Jewish immigrants in the United States, the first Jewish people who came to the United States were Sephardi Jews who were coming from Western Europe. But in the 20th century, we have, as I talked about before, this kind of exodus of Jews from the Ottoman Empire and former Ottoman lands. And, it's the term that we've come to use in the United States. We talk about like Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews, as I was saying, but in the early 20th century, on the one hand, people around the world in general were thinking about their identity in much more local terms, right? When community members of Or VeShalom and Etz Ahayem in Atlanta and Montgomery were, immigrating to the U.S., they were from Rhodes, that they were Rhodesly. And then, there's a number of kind of terms that are at play in the United States. Some, as I said before, like Oriental Jews, Levantine Jews. You also have, sometimes Arabic-speaking Jews, Ladino-speaking Jews, Greek-speaking Jews. But eventually, for a number of reasons, Sephardi became kind of the predominant term. Some of this happens by scholarship after the fact, but there was also sort of a Sephardic campaign that really promoted these Ladino-speaking Jews to call themselves Sephardic, and that in large part had to do with the connection between the term Sephardi and Spain. Sephardi Jews came from the Iberian Peninsula, and the term Sepharad actually comes from the Hebrew Bible, and it was a place that no one really knew where it was or what it referred to, and so Spain became Sepharad. Sephardi comes from that. So in a sense, it was, I think, kind of tied up with this kind of move towards Sephardi as the preferable term was very much tied up with, the types of experiences that Sephardi Jews and many immigrants and native-born Americans were having in the early 20th century in this context that was, really charged, and in which kind of Jewishness as a religion, as a race, as an ethnicity was, very much up for debate. And for a number of reasons, a lot of them kind of rhetorically advantageous, Sephardi became the predominant term.
Often Sephardic Jews are defined by the languages they spoke and continue to speak, especially Ladino.
Ladino is a Judeo-Spanish dialect. It is typically written in Hebrew or Rashi characters, which are, maybe similar to a slightly modified Hebrew alphabet, Meribah Hebrew alphabet. And it is, different in different contexts, right? It's this language that kind of comes out of Spain after the Spanish expulsion, and in North Africa, in the Middle East, becomes, infused with Arabic in certain contexts, with Turkish in certain contexts, with Greek in certain contexts, and then in the US with English, sometimes even with Yiddish, as I mentioned, with those glossaries in the newspaper. But it is a Judeo-Spanish dialect that comes out of Spain, and that was spoken by those descendants of those who were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain and Portugal, I should say.
But Ladino played a big part, a huge part. I had one member, Raymond Cohen, who always spoke Ladino. Now, whether he actually knew Ladino, I don't really know, but he was proud of the fact that he was transferring the memory of the language of his people in Montgomery. But eventually, I think the Ladino language has really been lost in the community. That's unfortunate. I never learned Ladino myself, but I could hear words that they used that they swore up and down were Ladino and meant something, but they couldn't remember what it meant.
When the immigrants came, when our parents came, they spoke Ladino. You've heard of Ladino, I'm sure. Ladino is really Spanish, but it's Spanish plus some Hebrew, plus some Aramaic, plus some Arabic, plus some Turkish words and some Greek words, all mixed into that language. My grandparents lived with us for a few years when I was little, so all they did was speak Ladino, and I learned it, and sure helped me get an A in Spanish when I was at Emory University. But that was interesting that we all spoke that. Even the earlier kids, they gave their bar mitzvah speeches in Ladino.
Let's back up to the beginning of our story. After the Jews' 1492 expulsion from Spain, many went to the Ottoman Empire, among other places. Centuries later, in the first decade of the 1900s, some of these Sephardic Jews began migrating from Turkey and the Isle of Rhodes to the south in order to pursue economic opportunity in the U.S. Just as a note, we'll be referring to these Jews as Ottoman Sephardic Jews at times throughout the episode. In later years, they were influenced by other factors, such as the desire to escape the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the Balkan Wars in the 1910s.
The first Sephardi immigrant who immigrated to the United States from Rhodes, as far as we know, is a man named Ralph Nace Cohen. And he was part of this 20th century diaspora that had just begun to start to take place of Sephardi Jews coming from places in the Ottoman Empire, including what is now and what was at the time kind of in the process of becoming Greece. And there were sort of a number of push and pull factors in terms of that immigration story. You know, we usually talk about immigration. I feel like that's one thing that stuck in my head from high school history is the push and the pull factors. And, you know, in 1909, there were new Ottoman conscription laws that many Jewish men left the region to avoid. You have the Balkan Wars in the early 1910s, and of course, in 1914, World War I starts. And so, you know, the way that a lot of these community members who've done oral history interviews at places like the Bremen talk about their choice or their parents' choice to come to the United States was that, you know, they felt that there wasn't much economic opportunity in places like Rhodes. The region was very much in flux. Of course, we know like war and violence leads to migration, as we know still in 2022. You know, the United States was also only one of sort of many options that were available to Jews from all around the world who were very much moving all of the time. They're, you know, this is kind of in a more broad context, also part of the story of the immigration from Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire that began in the 1880s as a result of numerous factors that are not super crucial for this particular story.
How many people left the island of Rhodes when people started coming? Did a large majority of the Jews of Rhodes?
Well, there were quite a few Jews that left Rhodes to go for a better situation. Just like I had two brothers that went to South Africa.
So a large majority, like when you said your mother was from Rhodes too.
My mother is from
So did a large majority?
Yeah, a large majority used to leave the island because there was no future there as far as anything like we have there, for instance. So they used to leave Rhodes and go to different places.
Most Ottoman Sephardic Jews went to larger cities like New York or Los Angeles, so sometimes it can be a little unclear why they ended up in the South. But both Atlanta and Montgomery clearly presented economic opportunities. Montgomery is the capital of Alabama and at the time attracted a growing immigrant population with its connection to 6 railroads and the navigational opportunities presented by the Alabama River, which encouraged trade. However, given its transportational connections, many of the Ottomans who first settled in Montgomery used the city as a stepping stone to other communities. Atlanta also presented commercial, industrial, and economic progress as the economic center of the South after the Civil War. By 1873, there were 5 different railroad lines in the city, and it had become a place to which Jews in general flocked. By 1880, there were 538 Jews of German or Austro-Hungarian descent in the city. Another explanation, an old wives' tale, is that the first Sephardic Jews to arrive in the South boarded a train and went as far south as possible to find warm weather.
In 1907, coming into Montgomery here was a Ralph Cohen, and he was the first Sephardic Jew in Montgomery. And so I can't say he came over because relatives were here. I think he might have come over because he heard that there were Jewish people in Montgomery, Alabama. But the old wives' tale that you hear about why he or others came over is that they came into Ellis Island, they went straight to the train station, they had X number of dollars in their pocket, they put it up on the ticket counter and said, I want to go as far south in the warm climate as my money will take me. They ended up in Montgomery, Alabama. That's one of the tales. Of course, it's strictly got to be a fable, but why they came, I'm not sure. But an awful lot of them migrated to the south. Others migrated to Seattle, Washington. Others migrated to Los Angeles. We have a big Sephardic congregation in Seattle. And of course, in New York, there's a big Sephardic congregation.
Another explanation was that Ralph Nace Cohen was sponsored by a Greek Orthodox friend. The Jewish community in Rhodes had a connection to the Greek Orthodox community, and the Greek Orthodox community traveled to the U.S. first and returned with positive news about it and the South, thereby establishing networks of migration. Cohen then established the Sephardic Jewish community in Montgomery.
This connection with the Greek Orthodox neighbors, which I think is, fascinating and surprising in a lot of ways because, part of some of the narratives of why a lot of Sephardi Jews were leaving places like what are now Greece is because of anti-Semitism, but this shows us that that's not necessarily true, and that was not necessarily, anti-Semitism is a part of these histories in a way, and a lot of ways. It's not kind of the defining element of these stories.
Traditional networks and lines of communication through the Jewish community then encouraged more immigration to the area, and between 1907 and 1908, 26 more immigrants arrived, bringing with them their Sephardic traditions. For example, in 1909, Sam Beton founded the Benevolent Society, which followed the Sephardic tradition of matar beseter, or anonymous giving. They collected money for the poor and donated it anonymously. This society in part functioned as a connection back to these individuals' families in Rhodes. They often sent money home to their families. In 1912, enough people had immigrated to Montgomery to establish a congregation, which they called Etz Ahayem. Etz Ahayem merged with another congregation in 2001 and became Agudath Israel Etz Ahayem, but the historic congregation is Etz Ahayem, so you'll hear us refer to it by that name throughout the episode. The founders of Etz Ahayem wrote their charter in Ladino, continuing that language tradition. They also continued certain other religious traditions that were passed down through generations.
The reading in the Sephardic congregations is different. Our prayers are a little bit different from the Ashkenazi.
I can remember when I was in high school, I went to the university one weekend in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and it was I had to give a minyan. I have to say the Kaddish in memory of my father because of the year of his death. And, you know, each year you have a ceremony and you recite the Kaddish. And I went to Hillel Foundation where the Jewish services were on Friday evening. And when I started reciting the Kaddish, people looked around at me, wondered who I was, where I came from.
On the day that, let's just say on Rosh Hashanah, we had some of these older fellas that would you were bidding on opening the doors of the ark, or you were bidding on a Torah.
Well, there'd be a Torah reading. The Haftarah would be a reading that would be auctioned off. The carrying of the Sefer Torah around would be auctioned off. And then you have a recitation by members would be called to the pulpit to read from the Torah, and they would make contributions to the synagogue. It wasn't very much in those days, but it was still something. Would contribute that amount. Had lead little grocery stores, delicatessens, cafes, all shoe stores. They had shoe repair shops, and that was by and large the business that they were in.
It would be just like an auction. They'd say, $10,000 dan por petehetaim, 20,000 dan. Somebody else would bid 30,000 dan. Another person would bid 100,000 dan. And they were just bidding in there, and finally the bidding would cease, and that person that had the highest bid, he would get the honor, and you'd have all of this pre-bidding going on that lasted maybe for an hour before the Torah services began. Well, I guess that got to be, they figured it was probably too commercial, number one. Number two, it probably took up too much time.
At times, these religious, cultural, and linguistic differences were off-putting for already established Ashkenazi communities, but the two communities were able to establish friendly relationships despite that. Many of our interviewees have stories about this tension between recent Sephardic immigrants and Ashkenazi Jews who were already in the United States.
Did you socialize with Jews from the other communities, Reform and Orthodox?
Not to begin with, no. After a while, there'd been some intermarriages, and then we amalgamated, you see.
What was it like when you first arrived?
First came out was separate. We knew we go to our own synagogue and they go to their own synagogue. They didn't speak Ladino, and they don't think we could speak Yiddish. So that was, so you don't speak Yiddish, you're not Jewish. That was the word, that's it. Sorry, we don't speak Yiddish.
But I think an important part of that history that bears stating is that the reason they formed their own congregations was not just the good reasons of wanting to preserve their standards and their practices, but also because the existing Ashkenazic community here in Atlanta rejected them and marginalized them. The Sephardic Jews of the world were historically and still to this day are marginalized by what is the majority Ashkenazic Jewish world, at least in the West. And so they found the need to create their own institutions, their own things, because they couldn't even get a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll from one of the Ashkenazic synagogues to use.
The historian Aviva Ben-Or, who I think I mentioned a couple minutes ago, coined this term coethnic recognition failure, which refers to this experience that a lot of Sephardi Jews who immigrated to the United States experienced, in which their Ashkenazi co-religionists did not recognize or, we might think in terms of like racial assignment, but it's not so much about race, but they didn't perceive them as Jewish. And there's fascinating stories, which comes from Or VeShalom, Rebecca Amiel, who was originally from Cairo and immigrated to Atlanta with her husband, Raphael, after he worked in the 1904 World's Fair. They immigrated in 1906, so they were some of the first kind of founding members of Or VeShalom, and they also hosted services at their house before they had their own building, before Or VeShalom owned their own building and were incorporated and all of that. And she has this fascinating story of encountering Ashkenazi Jews in Atlanta who did not believe that she was Jewish because she didn't speak Yiddish. And she says that she had to go inside and she brought out a mezuzah with a Hebrew inscription and showed it to them. And then finally, they believed that she was Jewish. And of course, there comes to be a ton of, contact and kind of intercommunal relationships between Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews in Atlanta. But that kind of is one of the kind of defining features of the early Eastern Sephardi experience in the United States. And
by the time Ralph Nace Cohen arrived in Montgomery, there were already 2 Ashkenazi communities there. In 1849, German immigrants established an Orthodox synagogue called Montgomery, which in 1862 became Reform and changed its name to Temple Beth Or. In the 1870s and 1880s, Eastern European Jews settled in Montgomery, and in 1901, they established Agudath Israel. Etz Ahayem actively worked to establish friendly relationships with the other local congregations, befriending local rabbis, lay leaders, and prominent members of these communities. Though they at times were restricted from social clubs, Sephardic Jews were often given support from Ashkenazi temples. For example, Temple Beth Or invited the children of Etz Ahayem to attend their Sunday school.
Temple Beth Or, which is the Reformed synagogue, was very, very friendly to our people from day one. They tried to teach them English.
Yeah, they taught us.
They did. That's right.
From Rhodes.
They gave them the first Sephardic Torah they ever had.
Oh, wow.
That's right. The Reform did that. And also, we used to send our kids to Sunday school to Temple Reform.
So you sent your children there?
At that time, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic were not.
They were
friendly. For a while, they didn't recognize us being Jewish.
I had heard that they didn't, because you spoke Ladino.
That's right, they didn't speak Yiddish.
Despite initial tension, these friendly relationships created porous boundaries between these communities.
And to begin with, as I understand from the people who first came here, that the Ashkenazi or the Orthodox Jews didn't believe that the Sephardics were Jews. They tried to tell them. So the Ashkenazi says, Mashimecha. Mashimecha, what's your name? You know that. See, that was a password they had. So since then, the Sephardics, the children of the Sephardics, picked up that word, Shimecho. That's Mashimecha. They said, oh, he's a Shimecho. They call them Orthodox or Ashkenazi, but Shimecho. That was the common word about some of the kids who went to college and so forth like that. But actually, I had to say this, but the Reform rabbi they had here was very, very friendly to the Sephardic Jews. They even lent them a Torah, because they had a room where they used to hold services. The Sephardic rabbi lent them a Torah to use until they could get one themselves or build a synagogue.
Now explain why the Reform Jews were more receptive to the Sephardic Jews than the Orthodox.
Well, the only thing that I can say is the fact that maybe they've experienced antisemitism, experienced mistreatment and so forth. They feel they need to take care of their own people. We are the Jews. After all, the Sephardics are Jews, and they knew that.
We'll get back to the idea of porous boundaries between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews later on, but another important porous boundary is that between Montgomery and Atlanta. Ottoman Sephardic Jews often traveled between the two cities depending on the opportunities that were available to them. Actually, the first Ottoman Jewish settlers to arrive in Atlanta were Victor Avzeradel and Ezra Toriel, who came from Rhodes, went to Montgomery, and then ended up in Atlanta in 1906.
There was a Solomon Rousseau who was here in Montgomery, and he went back to the Isle of Rhodes and married one of their daughters, Sultana. They came back to Montgomery after they went into New York, they got married in New York, and then they came back into Montgomery. After about a year or so, they started sending over for 2 or 3 of the family every year or so, and they finally got them all over, and then finally they got my grandfather over, and then after a couple of years, then they got he sent for his wife and the 2 remaining children there. They all came into Montgomery. They lived here for about 3 years, and then the entire family moved to Atlanta.
More immigrants followed, and in 1910, 40 Atlanta families founded Congregation Agudath Shalom.
Not surprisingly, 2 years later, some of the families from Turkey decided they didn't like the synagogue, and typical, they organized another synagogue. So you had one synagogue primarily with people from Rhodes, and the other synagogue 2 years later with people from Turkey. And then sanity finally prevailed. And in 1914, the 2 synagogues merged, and they became Or VeShalom. And they grew, and people continue to come to Atlanta from the Sephardics from Turkey and Rhodes.
Like Etz Ahayem in Montgomery, Orva Shalom was also relatively friendly with some of the existing Ashkenazi congregations. These congregations also sometimes provided them with support. For example, Eastern European Jews established Congregation Agudath Achim in 1887. After the establishment of Or VeShalom, Agudath Achim allowed them to use their section of the Greenwood Cemetery until 1921, when Or VeShalom purchased their own lot.
I don't think that there was any strong relationship between my father's congregation and the Reforms. I'd say that there was some closeness between the Ashkenazi, those Jews from Middle and Eastern Europe, and us. They were more closer to our type of religion and customs, and not quite as liberal thinking as the others. They knew the others and they spoke, but I don't think there was any social mingling there even. Just like I say, it was basically a close-knit situation.
Or VeShalom also used the help of Sephardic Jews from the Montgomery community. For example, as they expanded in 1918, they purchased a new synagogue building with the help of Solomon Rousseau of Montgomery. So what did Sephardic communities look like in the South? What did these immigrants do once they arrived here?
My father, as well as most of the Sephardic men that came, were shoemakers. Some of them had restaurants, some of them had fruit stands, but most of them, you could go downtown Atlanta in the 20s and 30s, and every block, I don't know how they made a living, but every block there was a shoe shop by one of the Sephardic men. Of course, women didn't work. And in Atlanta, the Sephardic Jews lived in a part of Atlanta, 2 streets. I'm sure you're not probably familiar with Atlanta, but 2 main streets, Prior Street and Central Avenue. They were about 8 blocks long. And on Prior Street particularly, every other house was occupied by a Sephardic Jewish family. And if it wasn't a Sephardic Jewish family, very likely it was a Greek family, because many Greeks immigrated around the same time and lived pretty close together. We were most like a ghetto where when we were growing up, no one had anything, but we didn't have enough sense to know we didn't have anything, and we all grew up reasonably happy. Our parents struggled pretty much, trying to make a living.
But the tremendous growth of Sephardic communities in the South was also accompanied by problems. There was a general lack of Sephardic rabbis because of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the conditions of interwar Greece. And rabbis often left the South for bigger opportunities than the Congregation of Atlanta, with its small size and resulting lack of funds, could provide. After cycling through a number of rabbis, Congregation Orva Shalom was finally able to find Rabbi Joseph Cohen, who served from 1934 until his death in 1981. Rabbi Cohen introduced curricula that departed from previous strictly Sephardic practices, while at the same time he emphasized Sephardic culture. Returning to the idea of porous boundaries between Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities, Rabbi Cohen also encouraged marriage and friendly interactions with Ashkenazi Jews, something that was happening in Montgomery as well.
You know, by the 1920s, really, these are like pretty significant communities with their own synagogues, and you know, they've kind of tapped into this transnational network of Sephardi communities in terms of the Ladino press and having local distributors and having their own buildings. And, you know, in Montgomery more so, they struggled with clergy, having a permanent clergy person there. But in Atlanta at Or VeShalom, by 1936, Rabbi Joseph Cohen, who went to rabbinical school in the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, and had been working in Cuba for a number of years, is hired by Or VeShalom. And he was there until his death, and you know, was emeritus rabbi after his retirement, and was really a huge pillar of the community in so many ways. So, you know, Or VeShalom certainly was off the ground before Joseph Cohen arrived, but by that moment, they're really certainly in Atlanta a full-fledged synagogue and community.
But in 1934, there were 135 families, Sephardic families, members of the synagogue. And from those 135 families, in 1934, there were 245 children who, we call them the firstborns here from the immigrants, which I was one of them. And then in those days, my generation, they pretty much stayed in Atlanta. Not like today where everybody's so mobile. The overwhelming majority of all of us, as I say, firstborns, remained in Atlanta, got married. And then probably in my case, my generation case, when we all lived in the ghettos, as I said, on Central Avenue, Prior Street, once we got into, I hardly ever met any Ashkenazi. We just didn't go anywhere, and we were all in our little ghetto. But when we went to high school, there were the assimilation of all of us, and that's when the Sephardic kids met the Ashkenazi, and then they became a little bit more worldly, you might say, and then we were able to. The Sephardics started moving out from the south side of Atlanta, probably in the early to mid 40s to very north side of town. And then our synagogue moved in 1948 and then again we moved in 71 when we built our building where we presently are.
Similar to Or VeShalom, in the 1950s, Etz Ahayem also began to struggle to find a rabbi. The community was integrating into American life. For example, in 1951, Hebrew and English replaced Hebrew and Ladino. The congregation wanted to retain their Sephardic traditions, but also account for that assimilation. Rabbis were also not really motivated to move to Montgomery, and the community struggled. They had to rely on lay leaders, such as Maurice Kapuya, and rabbis or chaplains from the nearby Maxwell Air Force Base. They also had to send their children to other congregations for religious school.
But now, since, take it back, say, for instance, the last 10 years or more, maybe, there have been cases where an individual had children and then we don't have the facilities to teach them bar mitzvah and this and that and the other. They join the Agudath Israel, the conservative synagogue, so the children can learn Hebrew and be bar mitzvah. But for a long time, I gave up my golf game on Wednesday afternoon and Saturday afternoons, and I instructed quite a few to bar mitzvah. I sure did. at our synagogue. I used to put it on tape, and they used to learn.
Would you instruct only Sephardic children?
Only Sephardic children, because we didn't have a rabbi. We didn't have a teacher. We couldn't afford to have one.
Did the synagogue ever have a rabbi?
Oh, yes. We've had rabbis. We've had rabbis after that. Well, before that, they had rabbis. Sephardic rabbis had 2 Sephardic rabbis. After that, we couldn't get one. And then the people began to feel it was, the salaries were a little more than we could afford. And then we were very, very fortunate in getting a chaplain from Maxwell Field, the Air Force base here. They had a chaplain school, and actually they always had a Jewish chaplain there. Then we contracted with them to let us have him, which they did. For the past 35 years, I guess we say, we had chaplains of all denominations. Reform, conservatives, you know what I mean, Orthodox. But this is going to be the last one we have now. They're not going to have many more.
As Maurice highlights, Etz Ahayem continued to have friendly relationships with the other congregations in Montgomery. For example, in 1976, the city's 3 temples celebrated over 200 years of Jewish history in Montgomery by presenting the state with a Torah scroll. Partly as a result of these friendly relationships and partly as a result of their small community size, many Sephardic Jews were marrying Ashkenazi Jews.
So was intermarriage between Ashkenazi and Sephardic, was that looked upon okay, or was that...
It has to look upon okay, that's right.
It was? Okay.
Well, you see, there was no other people, no other relations anywhere here. So.
Mm-hmm. So did that when did the community start to kind of gather together a little bit more, and they had better, would you say with intermarriage. Or?
Because of intermarriage, that brought us up closer together.
How about during World War II? Did that help the communities come together too?
Well, no, they were not together then.
A few of our Sephardic men were in the service.
Okay.
World War II. Young Raf's father.
After World War II is when we began to get married, intermarried.
Oh, after World War II.
Yes.
Okay. And is there a reason why? Just
well, there was no other way. Look around and see if you want to get married. You don't have any girls around, so you go to the Ashkenazi. They
had quite a few intermarriage too.
Okay.
Because of a lack of rabbis, assimilation into the Ashkenazi community, and the fact that children had been moving out of the South and not returning, Etz Ahayem continued to shrink into the 1990s. In 2001, with only 22 families registered at Etz Ahayem, the congregation merged with an Ashkenazi congregation, Agudath Israel, to become Agudath Israel Etz Ahayem, which maintains a mix of both cultures. What's fascinating is that the 1999 oral history interviews we feature in this episode were conducted just 2 years before the Agudath Israel Etz Ahayem merger. You can hear Albert Kapp and Maurice Kapuya talking about the future merger, which even in 1999 was inevitable.
We're in a congregation here in Montgomery, Etz Ahayem, which is, well, it used to be a lot larger, but it's gotten smaller and smaller over the time, and it's gotten so small that we have not been, for years we were unable to even have a Hebrew school, a Sunday school, and consequently, and we used Temple Beth Or and sent our kids to the Sunday school there, and we paid them a certain fee and for the educational privileges. And to bar mitzvah, we'd have some of the elders of the congregation teach the young ones, and then at times we had rabbis, and at other times we didn't. And when we had a rabbi, he would teach it, and he would conduct the bar mitzvahs and so on and so forth. But in the meantime, since we don't have a Hebrew school and since we don't have Sunday school, a lot of our children have joined the other congregations. So, we've just lost members by virtue of death and natural attrition. We've gained no new members. We've lost our children, basically. They might still be a member of this congregation, but they're really members of the other congregation, and that's where the energy and efforts are. And, we've just gotten smaller and smaller. And, it's just a matter of time, and our congregation, Etz Ahayem, will disappear. You've got a few like me that's a little bit older, and as we go, it's just going to get weaker and weaker and smaller and smaller. And of course, our only salvation is to possibly merge with the other congregation here in town. And that's ultimately what's going to happen, is ultimately what's got to happen. There's going to be a few diehards that are going to say, hey, let's keep this thing going as long as we can. But, to me, I'd like to keep it going. But if I want to think long range, if I want to think what's good for the Jewish community here in Montgomery and what's good for the continuation of Judaism here in Montgomery, then I say that we need to kind of pool our resources and join with those who are going to perpetuate Judaism. And so we're really in a dilemma right now as far as this congregation is concerned.
I think the merger can kind of more broadly be contextualized by sort of a few things that were going on at the end of the 20th century. One is that a lot of young Jews are leaving places like Montgomery and going to bigger places, bigger cities, usually more urban areas. Some people have said that is because of economic opportunity. Some people say a lot of Jews left Montgomery because they wanted to be where there were larger Jewish communities. I think these are like the types of choices that we all make in our lives, and it's kind of hard to say overall why these things happened. But we see in a lot of places in the South, Jewish communities are shrinking, and also more broadly, the kind of end of the 20th century was kind of the beginning of the decline of membership in synagogues in general in the United States, that I think has really kind of become really clear today. But the kind of peak of synagogue membership in the United States had sort of already passed by the late 90s. And so there is kind of just a shrinking community of people who are going to Etz Ahayem in general, who are filling positions. And as I said, like, they struggled to find a permanent rabbi and to find staff all throughout the 20th century. By the late 1990s, it's kind of seen as a little bit inevitable. I think at that point, the way they talk about it is like, it's unfortunate, but the way things are going, this is how it's going to go. And of course, they were right. But what I know about the synagogue today is that, like, they still preserve their Sephardic traditions in a lot of ways. And it's also a much more kind of, maybe, I don't know if pluralistic is the right word, but it's, not exclusively a Sephardic synagogue anymore. So, on the one hand, I think, certainly in the oral history interviews, they talk about it as a negative thing, but I think, and can, of course, can be contextualized in these sort of broader American Jewish trends, trends in the American Jewish community. But I think this merger is also, just a continuation of the type of like community support that was going on between these Sephardic synagogues and other synagogues in Montgomery and Atlanta and each other.
It wasn't an easy thing to do the merger, but I think over the years, I think we think of ourselves less as a merged community and more of a single community. And I'm really proud of that, actually.
While Etz Ahayem was struggling in the 1950s and 1960s, Congregation Or VeShalom was expanding and becoming more affluent. In the 1980s, it numbered about 350 families. Over this period, it also became a more mixed congregation with some Ashkenazi members as well as Sephardic Jews from Morocco.
It's probably the oldest Sephardic congregation in the state of Georgia, just like we're the only Sephardic congregation in the state of Alabama. Today it's, well, going years back, and I went to Hebrew school there, it was a small congregation. It was a little wooden frame house, and then as years went on, they moved to a spot on Highland Avenue, and then finally to the spot they're in now, and it's a multi-million-dollar type situation, and enlarged, and parking, and the whole works. At first it was strictly Sephardic Jews, those Jews from the Isle of Rhodes, from Turkey, and that general area there. Today, it is considered a Sephardic congregation, but they've got people from Cuba, they've got Sephardics, non-Sephardics, a complete mixture. If I had to say the majority, I'd say the majority of the members there are not Sephardic, but they are members of the Sephardic congregation. And it is a very strong congregation there in Atlanta.
Despite its more mixed composition, the congregation retains its Sephardic identity. This is due to an increased interest in Sephardic culture and heritage that began in the 1970s. The congregation continues to use Ladino, and they also continue some of their traditional food ways.
I would love for you to talk about the Obs Sisterhood's baraka making.
So almost 50 years ago, a number of the women here decided that rather than each person baking themselves at home, they'd get together at the synagogue and do it together and make it almost like a social hour. And it sort of morphed over time into them realizing when they worked together, they had more than what they each made their own and had leftovers. They started as a cook, sort of selling it as an income maker for the synagogue. It sort of grew and grew and started really our Hanukkah Bazaar, which actually our annual Sisterhood Bazaar, which initially was happening over Purim. It was actually part of the Purim Carnival. And then somewhere around 30 years ago, they transitioned it to Hanukkah time. I'm not exactly sure why. And now it's sort of one of those things in the city where, you think of, major holidays as, days that that you put on the calendar of, when's Labor Day, when's MLK Day. And for a lot of the Jewish community in Atlanta, it's when's the OVS Bazaar Day, and they know it. Traditionally, it was sort of first come, first serve to buy them until they ran out. Sales open usually at the bazaar at 11 a.m. By 10:45, we have a line of 50 people long waiting for it to open. And they really, it's one of those things where people come and have social hour. There have been different documentaries about it. And one of the people joked, it's coming there is cheaper than therapy. But it really is a great mixing of women and some men who also come as well, who both bake barekas and make, as a moneymaker for the synagogue, but also have great camaraderie and socialization.
There are so many things we can talk about as we reflect on this story over 100 years after it began. In speaking with our interviewees, I noticed so many different and interesting themes emerge. Dan Masley talked about the pride he has in a community that had to work hard to make ends meet in a new country.
It was just a big community, and to this day, at our synagogue, we still have. They're not this list. I told you about 245 of us firstborn. There are about 45 of us still alive, and we still see each other. We still go out and socialize with each other. We're losing them one after another, but it was a pleasant thing, even though we didn't have much of anything. The main thing I parents insisted on was that we get an education. I mean, that was their primary goal, and most of us did. When I look back at these 245 people, and I knew just about every one of them, I did. There were a good bunch of kids that came out of this group, and I'm proud to be part of it.
Members of both congregations highlighted the tension between tradition and assimilation, and the ways in which people are preserving Sephardic traditions even as families grow and change.
There's still families that still have their traditions that we did 100 years ago. But then there are more that do not, and have gotten away from being a part of the synagogue, but still maintain that they are Sephardic. But as each generation goes, more and more people pull away from the synagogue. And yet, if you look at our membership now, we still have a lot of them that are third and fourth generations, but not as many as I would like us to have had.
As we said earlier, historically it was Jews from the island of Rhodes in Turkey who came and established the congregation. Over time, there have been various influxes from other different Sephardic communities, but also influxes from outside the Sephardic world. And I would say, me or my children are great examples of that, where you've got, 2 generations ago, 100%, Sephardic Mediterranean Jewish. Me, I'm half and half. My kids have a quarter. And then, so what does it mean to have, the mixing of those traditions? Which again, it's the, what does it mean in, today's day and age? And what does it mean to relate to that group that's here now? And then how do you balance out where you historically came from and what your membership looks like today, where they're going?
We talked a lot about memory, especially in communities where the core members of the congregation are aging.
It's an elderly congregation. It's unfortunately, that's a lot of the synagogues in the South are like that. They're very, I like to say, they're very amoebic. Kids grow up, they leave, and then the parents don't want to leave until later in life. So wind up going from 300 families in Montgomery to less than 100 right now, and mostly elderly. But there's no one really left that knows what their traditions were. We don't have any original immigrants from the island of Rhodes. Everybody here is now second and third generation, and all they have is stories. They don't really know. Their traditions really weren't passed down very well. I think everybody in this community worries about what's going to happen to the memory of their communities.
I hope that this episode has proven the importance of understanding that Sephardic Jews have always been a part of the Southern Jewish story.
What I'm trying to get to is that Sephardic Jews have been writing their own histories and telling their own histories this whole time. And some of that looked scholarly and, what we would consider more like mainstream or traditional forms of history. And some of it was kind of internal. A lot of the sources that I used to write my thesis, and that I imagine like you guys have used too, were generated by members of this community, of these communities. And, while I think kind of the field of Jewish studies more broadly and, also the Jewish community more broadly outside of the academy are, really reckoning with the kind of ways that power has shaped the histories that we know and that we don't know. But I think the crucial part of what I'm trying to say is that Sephardi Jews have been writing and telling their own stories, at least in the 20th century, this whole time. One of the first things that Rabbi Joseph Cohen did when he came from Cuba to Atlanta was write a communal history of Or VeShalom up until that point. And he wrote it in Spanish because that's what made the most sense. And of course, it was later translated in English when the congregation published their own congregational history composed of Joseph Cohen's original history, translated into English, and a number of articles written by congregation members. And, you know, of course, we could also get into this whole conversation about genealogy and family histories, but that's certainly been, you know, I think has exploded because of the internet and because of things like Jewish Gen and Ancestry.com, but also people have been doing, you know, family histories for a long time. They just didn't have internet resources, and people were writing family histories of their Sephardi families. And, you know, I think one reason why, I mean, of course, there's like the impulse that I think so many of us have to tell our own family stories, but also maybe because they felt like they weren't being told by other people. And so they, you know, kind of took matters into their own hands and wrote their own histories. And, you know, all of the research, I mean, all of the research that I did, all of the sources that I used were generated by members of these communities. And, you know, it's still the case. I mean, there's still people, you guys have talked to some of them, I'm sure, who are doing, you know, great work on their own communities or their own families. And, you know, I'm glad that, you know, scholarship, the ivory tower, is starting to catch up a little bit.
You are cordially invited to attend Congregation Or VeShalom's annual Hanukkah Bazaar to sample some of the Sisterhood's delicious barekas. And you can learn a lot more about Jewish life in Atlanta and Montgomery in the ISJL's Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities. We want to make more episodes about Sephardic life in the South, so if you have family stories to share, I hope you'll shoot me an email at heritage@isjl.org. My thanks to Rabbi Josh Hershen, Adam Kafinas, Dan Masley, Rabbi Scott Kramer, and Mimi Brown Wooten for lending their expertise on this episode. Thanks also to Josh Parchel for his help with our oral history collection. And enormous thanks and congratulations to Annika Jones for her very hard work on this episode. This project was made possible by a grant from the Mississippi Humanities Council through support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Join the ISJL Virtual Vacation on Tuesday, May 31st for an in-depth conversation with Samantha Rosenthal, co-founder of the Southwest Virginia LGBTQ+ History Project, a queer public history initiative based in Roanoke, Virginia, and author of the new book, Living Queer History, Remembrance and Belonging in a Southern City. We'll talk about the overlaps and intersections between Southern, queer, and Jewish identities, and the importance of place and space in queer history. I am an enormous fan of Samantha's work, and I'm so excited to share this conversation with you. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time for more stories from the Jewish South.